Hi everyone, welcome back to Is It Art, where we ask the same question every time. Today we're going to be looking at Ari Aster's Midsommar and the way in which it explores structural power and the anxiety it creates. Ari Aster, for those of you who don't know, is the director of 2018's contemporary classic Hereditary, and also one of distribution company A24's director darlings. A24 being the distribution company which has taken both box office and critical acclaim by storm. Midsommar, although maybe not receiving the same critical acclaim as Hereditary, offers an interesting exploration of structural power and anxiety through its genre bending and sort of dual narrative structure. Now, to dive right in, we're going to be dealing with a couple of different dualities. The first of which is the way in which Midsommar operates as sort of both horror and fairy tale. To take the words from the director himself, on the A24 podcast, Ari Aster described it as horror adjacent, saying that the kind of trick of the film is that for all of the characters except for Danny, it's a horror film without any kind of pretension otherwise. But for Danny, it's a kind of perverse fantasy fulfillment, which ultimately ends up as a fairy tale given her development and her arc. Now, the genres of horror and fairy tale are interesting because they both play with anxiety. And just to cover this really briefly, horror deals with anxieties that are unresolved in the audience, whether it's a fear that your child might hate you, or your lover is a murderer, or, etc. And horror plays with them in a way that doesn't offer any kind of resolution, but does provide a kind of transgressive pleasure for the audience to view a symbolic representation of anxieties that they might have otherwise unexpressed. Fairy tale, on the other hand, offers resolution to anxiety through the development of the subject. With the Three Little Pigs, they best the big bad wolf, as does Little Red Riding Hood. Sleeping Beauty and Snow White escape the witch, so does Hansel and Gretel, all through some kind of virtue, cunning, intelligence, hard work, etc. Some trait that signals a development of the subject. Now, what's particularly interesting about Midsommar is the way that it takes two genres which play with anxiety in seemingly divergent ways, one offering no resolution and one offering almost explicit resolution. But the fact that they both deal with anxiety leads us to wonder what the anxiety is. And I'm here to contend that anxiety in Midsommar is structural power. The framing narrative, when we're introduced to Danny and her friends as sort of graduate PhD students, etc., establishes the structural power in a number of ways. The murder-suicide that we see at the beginning of the film expresses the anxiety of what one might do to escape a certain kind of structural power. And then the fairy tale offers a solution to it, although the solution offered is horrifying. And just to clarify, some of you may be wondering what I mean when I use the phrase structural power. And to give a few examples, structural power is what makes you feel nervous when a police officer pulls you over, even though you haven't broken the law. It's the reason why, even if you prove a teacher wrong, they can still fail you on a test. Structural power informs why men in business suits are treated differently at restaurants than teenagers in hoodies. It's why if your boss asks how you're doing, you say, "Good, how are you?" instead of "Shitty, leave me alone." It informs why you feel bad if you don't call your parents on holidays. It explains when a teammate or coworker takes credit for your ideas and you don't call them out on it. It's a kind of invisible hand in the social economy, which can be traced only meticulously. Only with a lot of effort can you figure out why someone agreed to something or someone went along with something, even though maybe they didn't want to. Certain thinkers use kind of vulgar terms around hierarchy to describe this, but it's such a nuanced, complicated subject that you almost need a word as ambiguous as power and as ambiguous as structural to understand the manifold ways it unfolds. With reference to Midsommar, we're going to be looking at structural power in a way that often looks like peer pressure, but the position that the various characters occupy kind of extends it beyond peer pressure. We're not just talking about a group of friends, we're talking about a particularly constituted group of friends and the way that Danny finds herself positioned within this social constellation. Now, the second duality that we're going to be addressing is the narrative duality. The first 30 minutes of the film take place in what I call the framing narrative. This is where Danny is a psych student amongst anthropology students. She has a boyfriend. She has a really normal life. It sets the tone for any kind of drama or coming of age story. The lighting is different than the rest of the film. It's more low light, more saturation, just feels very sort of realism. After about the 30-minute mark, the film makes a noticeable shift, both in lighting, scene, and the way that it progresses. And from then on, we're basically in a fairy tale of Danny's making. Now, to start with the framing narrative, we are introduced into this sort of trapped feeling of social and structural power that Danny is enmeshed in. Again, she's a psychology student among anthropologists, feeling some degree of alienation there. Her boyfriend, Christian, wants to break up with her, but she doesn't want to break up with him. She's only seen with his friends, always kind of outnumbered and outmatched. She has to constantly emotionally self-police, like when she finds out that Christian is going to Sweden, making these large plans without even mentioning it to her. She can't even be mad. She actually ends up apologizing in that exchange. But importantly, the first 30 minutes establish an unhealthy relationship between Danny and Christian, an unhealthy social structure between Danny and Christian's friends, and potentially society at large as she ends up taking a hiatus from school, etc. There's a few visual cues that indicate that we're leaving the framing narrative and then going into this kind of portal to the fairy tale. On the one hand, when they're in the airplane, there's severe turbulence, and then also when they're in the car, it's shot from upside down, reminiscent of a kind of Alice in Wonderland into the looking glass type portal situation. When they arrive, though, the social dynamics are pretty much the same. One of the first things that happens is they're offered to take psilocybin mushrooms. At first, Danny is hesitant. She wants to kind of find her bearing in this new environment. A pretty reasonable ask, but that doesn't take into account the social structure that's happening, because Danny is with Christian and Christian is with Christian's friends. So when Danny says that she wants to wait, Christian then plays the role of benevolent boyfriend and says, okay, I'll wait with you. But Christian's friends are also there and they say, no, we should take it together. There's an interesting body language that happens here as well, as Christian physically moves away from Danny and says, no, I'm going to wait for Danny, clearly positioning her as the reason why he is not with the rest of his friends. There is a very important, awkward pause, and then Danny says, no, it's okay, I'll just do it. This maneuvering of social dynamics speaks volumes, because what we see here is a way in which Danny totally goes back on her initial position. What she actually wanted and what she thought would be best for herself, she ends up totally compromising because of the social situation that is happening. And this goes a little bit deeper than peer pressure, because Christian can play a kind of double role here, where on the one hand, because of his structural position, he knows they're going to end up taking the shrooms, but he can still play the role of benevolent boyfriend and act as though he's on Danny's side, even though he is also the reason why Danny ends up being pressured into taking the shrooms. This provides the first of a series of hallucinogenic experiences that Ari Aster provides for the audience and is worth taking some time on. After they take the shrooms, Danny has a pretty classically bad trip. It initially starts fine, but then is triggered at the word family, and the trauma that she just endured is kind of resurfaced. But there's a few key details about what she encounters on this first hallucinogenic episode that are worth looking at. The first of which is that she references her birthday. And this is something that could be kind of passed off, but if one is having a sort of panic attack, the idea that your birthday somehow represents a resolution to that is interesting, and probably refers to the fact that at birthdays, you're the center of attention, that you sort of have authority over what's going to happen, and that people are supposed to respect your wishes, which, as we've seen, is kind of the opposite of the social position she currently occupies. Right after she makes this kind of consolation to herself, though, she hears people laughing and then says, they're laughing at me. She internalizes the idea of alienation, the fact that she is outside of the group, outside of the power structures that are going on, and feels further isolated. Again, this is reflected when she goes into a shed, sees a reflection of her sister, the kind of trauma and the image of this alienation, and then sees her own image kind of shattered. Her face morphs as if it's a physical reflection of the trauma that she's carrying. As the film moves forward, we see a number of different examples of how Danny relates to the structural power and the social structures that she inhabits. But for a second, I want to take a step outside of Danny and talk about structural power and social power kind of in general, but specifically with the figure of the anthropologist. Now, importantly, everyone that Danny is on the trip with is an anthropologist. Christian's an anthropologist, Josh, it's assumed Mark is as well. And within the narrative elements of the story, the fact that they're anthropologists serves a pretty clear function. It gives them a reason for being there. But from an analysis standpoint, the fact that they're anthropologists is quite interesting because anthropology itself is a subject kind of worthy of critique or at least of analysis. Drawing from works from Edward Said in Orientalism and Clifford Geertz, specifically his essay Anti-Cultural Relativism, one finds a pretty rich critique of certain strands of Western anthropology. And the critique goes something like this. The Western anthropologist presents themselves as something of a clear lens, a neutral observer just seeing what's happening. Yet every person is subjectively constituted from where and when they are from, thus not neutral. So when the Western anthropologist presents themselves as neutral, they present where they're from as neutral, thus presenting Western society with its Judeo-Christian influences, with Enlightenment thinking, with our particular set of taboos and cultural practices. They present this as neutral, as the basis, as something universal in this way. And the reason this is important is because if you are part of the universal, you have power. You are part of everyone, and anyone who is different than you is foreign, exotic, oriental, etc. And this again goes back to when Danny, referencing her psychology degree, says, "That's how you know I'm nuts." This kind of self-diminishing that happens because she is outside of the norm of her social situation. Now, while the entire field of anthropology might not necessarily need to be condemned, we do have a particular representation of the anthropologist in the character Christian. And the way in which Christian, as an anthropologist, and occupying the various structural positions of power that he occupies, and being clearly willing to leverage them, comes to a head in one of the most horrific scenes of the film, Danny's birthday. Now, in this scene, Christian has forgotten Danny's birthday and kind of brings up this half-assed piece of cake and tries to light it while singing happy birthday to her, this gross juxtaposition of American culture superimposed onto the Horga aesthetic where everyone's dressed differently. It's totally out of place to be doing this, and Christian seems kind of unaware of it, or at least indifferent to it. And there's nothing heartfelt in this expression. It's clear obligation on his part. And he kind of goes through this act. He can't get the candle lit, etc. Danny just wants it to stop. She says, "Stop. I'm not upset." Christian says, "You should be." She says, "Yeah, I should be." Now, this is what's interesting, is that you have both characters admitting that a wrong has been committed here, that Danny should be upset, but she can't be. Why she can't be upset is left implicit. It kind of lingers in the air. But the reason is because she's there with Christian's friends. In some sense, Christian's friends are her whole social network. And so her position within the structural power kind of prohibits any real antagonism, any real kind of show of anger. And the second way that Christian leverages his position of structural power comes up again when it comes to the topic of writing a thesis about Horga, where Christian basically steals Josh's thesis. Now, we know that Christian has been slacking on his work previously, and we know that the whole trip was sort of Josh's idea. He kind of put all of this together. Yet, Christian just swoops in. He just comes in and says, "I'm going to do this. We can collaborate or we cannot." And in doing so, he basically steals something from Josh, but in such a way that if Josh is going to call out the aggression, then Josh has to seem aggressive. Christian's theft is such that he can position himself, again, benevolently. He can say, well, if you want to work together, we can work together. If you want to share, we can share. And in this sense, implying that if Josh doesn't want to share, then Josh is the one who is being aggressive, in the wrong, etc. The ways in which Christian is willing to leverage or abuse his positions of structural power kind of builds as the narrative progresses in a way that makes him increasingly dislikable throughout the film. As we turn to the progression of the film, we see a distinct power shift start to happen. Christian's friends disappear one by one, usually for different cultural infractions. Simon, one of the visitors to Horga, curses the stolpa. Mark pisses on the sacred tree. Josh takes forbidden pictures of the sacred text, ultimately leaving Christian alone. At the same time, though, Danny is becoming more and more accepted in the Horga community, ultimately becoming their May Queen. When Danny is crowned as May Queen, we see a distinct power shift. Here, Danny is dressed like the Horga people. She seems to fit in. She seems adored. They literally lift her up above them. Meanwhile, Christian is increasingly ostracized. And now, during another hallucinogenic experience that Ari Aster provides with us, it's Christian who has a bad trip, seeming alone, having no sort of recourse. And within this bad trip, Christian commits his kind of final infraction, having sex with Maya, cheating on Danny. This final transgression seems to be, again, an attempt at leveraging structural power. However, Christian seems blind to the fact that that structural power is gone. His friends aren't there. They're not in the same sort of Western society that privileges him in the way that Danny was otherwise unprivileged. And so his aggression is seen kind of for what it is. And when Danny witnesses it, she is upset. She's horrified. And we see a visualization of Danny's newfound structural position and the fact that her horror at Christian's act is refracted in the other members of the Horga community that are with her. At this point, then, we have seen a total reversal of the structural power that we started with. And this was kind of the role of the fairy tale. As Ari Aster described it, it's a kind of perverse fantasy fulfillment. What if, instead of Danny being dependent on Christian's friends and therefore being subjected to the structural power that entails, Christian was subjected to Danny's friends, that Danny held all of the structural power, that she was the one who was the queen in the situation. And this leads us to the end scene, the sacrifice. The way the film is resolved is Christian is dressed in a bearskin to be sacrificed as a totemic representation of that which is wicked within all of us. One of the Horgi clergymen says explicitly, "Mighty and dreadful beast, with you we purge our most unholy affects. We banish you now to the deepest recesses where you may reflect on your wickedness." This invites the question of what wickedness is Christian supposed to be reflecting on, and what wickedness is reflected in all of us, our deepest unholy affects. And I think that the progression throughout the film kind of illustrates that. Christian's willingness to leverage his structural power to try to play this double role as benevolent actor and also brutal manipulator seems to be a pretty unholy affect to me. And so then we move to the final shot where Danny is seen smiling at the temple burning with Christian burning inside of it. The music takes an upward movement, and we have a sort of feeling of relief or catharsis. And thus, the fairy tale is concluded. Danny is May Queen, living within Horga, having purged herself of Christian and the wickedness he represents. And within the framing narrative, there's also resolution to be found. If we go back to what Danny's life was before, as a PhD student, graduate student, it's pretty safe to assume that she doesn't go back to that. And so in a sense, she is dead from that life, and those closest to her, Christian and his friends, are also dead. And so it doesn't seem like a stretch to think that Danny has somehow found an understanding of her sister's actions, of the murder-suicide of her sister and her parents, that this kind of makes sense to Danny in a way at this point that it never did before, and that she can somehow be released of it. But this is a horror film. And this film was produced and initially released to Western culture, and while within the structure of the fairy tale there's resolution, it's a kind of resolution that the audience can't share. Since we are in reality still enmeshed in our various systems of social and structural power, we are almost obliged to condemn this representation of resolution. We almost must find it horrifying. And so the film ends on a deeply ambiguous note. It provides what a horror film provides, a kind of transgressive pleasure. Some part of us would like to see our most unholy affects and the people that represent them, burned alive. There's something of a release in that, perhaps. But within our moral structures, we can't condone that. That doesn't operate as a kind of real resolution. And so we're left a bit uneasy, a bit ambivalent. To summarize, Midsommar is horrifying because it explores elements of structural power that the audience feels within society. They feel this in their everyday life, when they're talking with their bosses, when they're talking with their friends, when they're ever in a situation that determines that they must act a certain way, even if it's not how they would otherwise act. Midsommar explores this through an unhealthy relationship and a representation of a certain kind of universalizing force in anthropology. And it presents a fairy tale resolution, which may work for Danny, but leaves the audience unsettled and ambivalent. So, Midsommar. Is it art? Oh, yeah. Through discussing lived anxieties on multiple dimensions, both symbolic and narrative, and offering a resolution as messy and ambivalent as life itself, Ari Aster has definitely produced a piece of art here. Well, hey, if you don't agree, if you agree, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Also, if you want to see more analysis, if you have suggestions, please subscribe to the channel. It would help me out a ton and help me get my own kind of URL, which I need. But I'd love to hear what you'd like me to talk about next, or your own thoughts on Midsommar. Did you love it? Was there parts of it that you felt like I missed that you would have wanted to see talked about more? I'd love to hear about it. Let me know. And until next time.